and the problems of the construction of minorities, migrants and refugees, which are so central, certainly in the Western world and in the global South, must be related to those changes. Then, of course, the maps you talk about are absolutely germane, because I've always held, and in my work on Frantz Fanon, particularly my introduction to The Wretched of the Earth, which was published a few years ago, I made it very clear that the work of the anti-colonial work might have been accomplished, but the work of decolonization and the work of the emergence of a nation is a different thing. You have the intervention in many of these countries that were disorganized, reorganized, dominated, hegemonized. You have the problems of their own poverty, their own lack of infrastructure. So you then have the Washington Consensus, the IMF coming in and making these treaties on the grounds of security, on the grounds of prosperity. And very often the two are linked. You know, democracy and security have always been linked. If these third world countries are not democratic, we will, in the West, will suffer. And of course, after 9/11, this was a major issue. So that's the second point, that I think there has been a kind of strategy of dependence which has perpetuated some of the problems of the post-colonial world and has reinstated some of the dominant structures of empowered surveillance control, the control of markets, and also, of course, soft power has been extended. So that's another issue. The third issue under the title of post-colonialism is, and I speak for myself here, has been the way in which post-colonial national governments have themselves contributed to their own problems, to the problems of these worlds. You know, the idea of tyrants, I have no question in my mind that one of the most destructive things were the attacks on the Middle East generated by the weapons of mass destruction myth. I have no doubt about that. I think this notion of making that whole area unstable was, we live with it today. However, at the same point, the societies which produced, often with the connivance of Western powers, tyrannical regimes, or corrupt regimes, or dishonest regimes, we must take responsibility for that too. Or militarized regimes, we have to take responsibility for that. And we don't have to do this in a pious way, saying, you know, we are good and you're bad. I think this ethics of polarization has been the destruction of what is so-called a global world. What is global if we cannot all get together and understand very simply that the forms that in a connected world, and this I'm again referring to Hannah Arendt, in a connected world, the barbaric practices don't come from outside. They also come from within us. We have to take responsibility. There is no neat moral algebra here. And I think most nations have not done that. They would love to point a finger at other regimes, other countries, other leaders. And what happens in all of that is, to go back to what I said earlier, that the profound problems of health equity, justice, education, all these poverty, inequality, that those issues have been tolerated as much by the new nationalists. And now, of course, we are in a state of, ethno-nationalist populism, which I think even is another harder layer. You cannot say that these governments have not themselves participated in what we have now, no doubt under the larger hegemony of Western powers and Western leaders. So finally, I want to say that what has been hugely neglected across the world, and the plight of the United States today is a reflection of this as much as in our parts of the world, is that we have not had an education which has been committed to creating a sense of civic affiliation across religions, faiths, communities, and ethnicities, and we have not had an education for citizenship. Producing remarkable software engineers is a remarkable feat, but that is not what holds a country together. That is not what holds the world together, or on ethical platforms of equitable, fair development and change. And of course, since 2011, I have never tired of saying that the notion of security in the cultural field, because that's the field I know, the notion of security in the cultural field has been disastrous, because now people do not look at other cultures and say, if we have an influx of your people, can we assimilate? Can we work together? They don't. Now they say, is your culture a killer culture or not? Will your culture, for some reason or the other, kill me? Are you a dangerous culture? Are you a terrorist culture? And of course, the mirror of this now stares the countries of the West in the face. The Attorney General, the new Attorney General in the Biden administration, has said absolutely unequivocally that domestic terrorism, the terrorism of largely white people against the state, is his top priority. So the kind of finger you point at others in this global situation of deep asynchronous and asymmetries that I've referred to, you cannot keep this out. It comes back to you. That is why there's a boomerang effect. That is why I think the great writer Joseph Conrad, in a great post-colonial text, which is appropriate for me to invoke today, said about the Congo and the huge human despoilation of the Congo, leave alone the economic exploitation of the Congo in the 19th century. And he said of the main character of his novel, Kurtz, who was the worst exploiter in that world, all of Europe was responsible for Kurtz. I'm saying we have to take that responsibility. I'm saying, again, sorry for repeating myself with Hannah Arendt, that in a globally connected world, the most barbaric, dangerous elements don't simply come from outside, they come from within. And we have to actually deal with that ambiguity, deal with that ambivalence, deal with that contradiction, and find a way of having the kind of honest, institutional and individual conversations that we're having today. And we've got to see that these kinds of dialogues are embedded in our educational structure.
Thank you very much for that very, very elaborate remarks. I think that was picked up some very interesting points on that. And before I move on to other speakers, I have a sub question, I think, from this entire conversation. And I think that goes on to the larger problems and the discourse in Pakistan, is that the concept of invisible chains. So the idea that in the developing world, that while the colonization ended, it was left with a particular elite that was Western in its mind, thinking, and that was connected to that global world order that was developed after the World War II. So the diseases, the poverty, it's not out of an accident. It's actually constructed. It's actually designed. So for instance, in a lot of underdeveloped countries where I've been able to do research, the idea was that the British times were perhaps better times there was a little bit more justice was still there. The issues were still much more mitigated than compared to what has happened when the colonization ended. I'm not trying to justify any colonization, but this is generally the mindset that has developed across the Middle East and South Asian countries, where the benefits of decolonization may not have traveled down to the point where there is a separation. So despite the fact that colonization has ended and there's decolonization world, the people still feel that the international is very much still present. I mean, you have events like Raymond Davis, you have events like United States raiding sovereignty of countries. And then that feeds into, for instance, the Muslim world, the larger Muslim world, and how exactly free are they? And one last point on that, where I would like to ask the question is that, do you think that when you talk about the problem from within, that within is also a result of decades and centuries of knots that were there? I mean, for instance, you've talked about tribal nationalism. President Trump, for instance, or Prime Minister Modi are a result of something that went wrong in that post-colonial period, the reaction to which is now what we see in a very racialized, very polarized. So and I think we had a discussion in the last time that the same leaders are now using the post-colonial discourses to essentially make a point against the Western societies and a return to a particular glorious days or something. So I would like your comment on that, and then I'll have Emmer and others to pitch in.
My dear Hussain, you have not asked me a question. You have woven a tapestry. And if I took every thread and followed it, my dear colleagues would not have any time to speak. But let me just respond now, because I've already spoken at great length and I'm feeling very guilty about it. But let me now just respond to a couple of things, and then with our colleagues, we can join our voices in a discussion. I don't want this to be about me. Let me just tell you this. I think that when what you said, I was not quite clear. On the one hand, you said that the nationalist leaders still had a certain kind of westernized idea of the new democracy, if I might put it that way. So they were bringing these westernized ideas, but that now, given that, as I said earlier, that the post-colonial is not the end of colonialism, it is other forms of domination in these countries that were once dominated for over 200 years or whatever. So I'm saying there is, of course, that continuity, but what I couldn't understand is whether, in fact, the people who say, actually, we were better off, society was fairer during the British times, whether they're critiquing their own national histories, or whether they're saying the national histories had no chance to be autonomous, or to the Bandung spirit, for instance, could never have thrived, because all these countries that had these wonderful aspirational ideas of equality, fraternity, joint prosperity, one emerged at a time of the Cold War. We should not forget that Frantz Fanon says, am I really free? I have my freedom. And then I'm asked, do you want to join with the United States or do you want to join with the Soviet Union? And there is a huge problem around security, definitions of progress, modernity, equality within them. So let's look at that complex issue. But when today, people in the global South, sometimes on issues of free speech or the free press, have to protect themselves using bits and pieces of an earlier British legislation, which had a certain kind of imperial liberal genealogy. They have to use that to defend themselves against charges of sedition if they make statements that are critical of the government. Then we're in a very complex situation. But at the same time, I just want to say something which may only be obliquely related. You know, the Western world is not that Western. The global North is not that northerly. The destinies of many of the ideas, the notion of the nation, the notion of citizenship, the notion of prosperity. Many of these ideas of Western liberalism, as you well know, emerged out of colonial rule. Very often they were oppressively used, but we were not silent. We who come from what was supposed to be the developing or the third world, we were part of that experiment. We were on the losing side of it, right? But it's not as if our countries, our cultures, these things were silent. We were agents in this. That is why we achieved our freedom. So I really think that there's too much made of West and non-West. The West has depended for its own construction on various ideas, various principles that emerged from the non-West, even if it then turned around and dominated these societies. And in many ways, non-Western societies, the Bombay I grew up in, teaches me about global cosmopolitanism in the way in which many Western countries don't. We lived in a culture. I mean, take Bollywood just for one thing. Now, I'm not talking about the current status of Bollywood, which has been very much limited by the powers that be. But take the language of Hindustani, take the music, take the mingling between various cultural groups. There is no cultural problem between India and Pakistan. What is the cultural problem? We read Manto, we read a number of remarkable writers. You read us, filmmakers. There is no cultural problem. I am saying that this West and non-West does not, it is also South versus South. There are so many polarizations. We need to think about these polarizations, why they are put in place, how they're militarized, how they're weaponized, even in the field of culture. They're weaponized. But do they really reflect the deep roots of our societies? I submit they don't.
Thank you very much. Emir, Mira, Zara, Zaraz, anyone?
Well, I mean, I could talk about, well, I mean, first of all, I mean, I agree, and there's a lot to agree with. I think that we do oversimplify, don't we? We are trained, I think, instinctively, perhaps, to think in terms of binaries, us, them, with, without, West, East, North, South, right? But reality is a lot more complicated than that. And I mean, I realize we're having an academic discussion here, but let's move that, say, to, because I know you're going to talk about the digital and the local. So if I'm, with your permission, if I were to say, jump the gun on that, right? I mean, look at our social media discourse. We cannot operate without binaries. Because what do we have now? We have digital tribes, right? I mean, to sort of take what Dr. Bhabha said in another direction, right? We cannot impose these, we cannot draw these lines. I mean, for example, now what you have is, and I hesitate to use this term a little bit, but you have digital internationals, don't you? I mean, if you look at, say, you know, the workers' movement, the late 1800s, and the history of the international, right? Now we have digital versions of that. Like, I could be, say, a member of the LGBTQ community sitting in Calcutta, may have less in common with his or her immediate culture, their immediate surroundings, and perhaps have more in common with another member of the LGBT community, say, sitting in Brazil, were they to be communicating online. Now, there are positives to that, and there are negatives to that. And the negatives to that are, for example, I'll give you the example of the Christchurch shooter, Brandon Tarrant, right? Yes, he comes from a Western milieu, but his tribe are not necessarily his neighbors, his family, and his friends. His tribes are tribe members comprise of other, say, white supremacists, say, ultra-nationalists, sitting in entirely different countries, with whom he may never meet, with whom his only interaction may be message boards and forums. Yet they are his people. Yet they are the people he will identify with before his immediate, say, geographical or even cultural markers come into play. So this is, to me, fascinating. As far as the polarization, I mean, absolutely. That polarization has in many ways been fostered, and it's been fostered. And I'm talking now within our own country, say within, let's narrow our focus to South Asia, right? It has been focused with a clear political objective in mind. Because if you don't polarize, if you don't otherize, how do you attract support for your own cause? I think we're seeing an example of that in Modi's India right now. God knows we have seen examples of that throughout Pakistan's history. So in many ways, I think that that's a deliberate and frankly cynical process that has been put into place. Secondly, again, and I completely will agree that, we have to look inwards. We have to also put our own house in order. Because, and Hussein, you may identify with this. I mean, how many decades did we ever hear that every problem that has ever been caused in our country was a result of some kind of foreign conspiracy, some kind of international conspiracy? This is not to say that the conspiracies don't exist, because the problem with conspiracy theories is that they so often prove to be correct. And then we're like sitting there and we're like, oh man, that's embarrassing, But so sometimes they do, but more often than not, they are a ploy just to distract and to unite me. Be like, what was it? Après moi le deluge, after me the flood. I am the only one standing here. And then that's what dictators across the global South have always said, what fanatical religious leaders across the global South say to this day. We are the last thing standing between you and this flood of, Western or foreign dominance, which will wipe out our culture, without even realizing that the culture you speak of has always been a work in progress, has always been a polyglot. A culture that erects barriers around itself does not deserve to exist, and it won't. Okay, now I think I've gone like very far off topic. So I'm just going to be quiet now.
So bravo. Can I just say something?
Sure.
I think we are completely in agreement. And I'm so sorry, friends. I will just end very quickly, but I just want to say, because I know that you're going to slip away. I don't think there is, I don't think there is an element of disagreement between ourselves. And I don't consider this to be an academic conversation. I consider this at the same time to be theoretical and very much one about principles, and principles are absolutely central to modes of action. So let me just say that I see the landscape, social media landscape, but that in a way strengthens the point I'm trying to make, that complicated though it is, forms of identification are no longer simply binary. They're no longer simply binary. If I can relate on the grounds of my sexuality to somebody who is in another country and I find an affiliation there, then my dear friend, at the same time, when I'm relating in other modes, which is not an LGBT modality, I'm also relating to people who are in my kith and kin, if only to disagree with them, if only they demean me. So I'm just saying now we don't have this binary, but you're absolutely right that the social media can actually act against cosmopolitanism while it is instantaneously international. And the way it allows you to do that is by restricting. It's an old mechanism. I only talk to those who I agree with. So I think that there is this complexity which argues against binarism and polarization, to say that exactly as I said earlier, when I said that cultures are weaponized, politics are weaponized to create these polarities, I think the only difference between us is I think that so much two-party systems or so much has been invested in beginning for making us see both morally and politically this notion of the binary. I have tried to suggest that if you look deeper into the binary, you find exactly those complex networks. Whereas as an LGBTQ person, I identify with somebody. But as a son, I identify with my mother contentiously or not. As a teacher living in Pakistan, or in India, I identify with the bureaucracy. So I'm saying that we don't need to construct binaries. I think we can go beyond it, sometimes successfully, and other times even unsuccessfully.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. This is very interesting. Emir or Meera, you want to add on that?
Sure, perhaps I'll pick up on a few of those points. Thank you all so much for the invitation and for the very rich discussion so far. I might stay with this theme of the social media world since it's one that we're focusing on. And just to layer onto what has already been said, which I agree with, one of the elements which is coming to light is the way in which the technology behind social media is specifically emotionally manipulative in order to addict you to certain streams of thought. So of course you are fed things which reinforce your biases, you are connected with people that share the same convictions, and this becomes an emotional addiction. Now this is politically dangerous insofar as you do not have time to process your response. You're clicking before you know it, you're liking before you know it, and the various mechanisms which you might have to exercise reflexivity are eroded, even amongst the most educated, the most well-rounded people. And so I think this is something that we have to grapple with, that our relationship to the information that we are now getting is mediated in a very different kind of way. And so, yes, absolutely. This underscores the fact that we need to move away from old binaries of, blaming outside forces and so on. But it actually also means that we need to exercise some kinds of suspicion amongst our allies in the sense that the production of particular alliances becomes naturalized. It looks normal. And so few people are aware of the ways in which this is produced. And this is, of course, one of the ways in which the internet produces extremism, that it casually introduces in an everyday sense content which is actually quite extreme. And so you find these, the WhatsApp groups of senior citizens who are otherwise interested in sharing stories about, their daughters and cats, sharing some quite extreme political material in this very casual way, because it's coming through without any filter in the same medium. So I think that's something we need to be aware of. Just to speak back maybe also to the wider point about how we understand the relationship between the colonial and the post-colonial world order, just to pick up something which I talked about a little bit in my book, Hussein, is this idea of disposability. And so one of the ways in which I think about the relationship between the past and present is that one of the things that the colonial order did was set up a hierarchy of disposability that was explicitly framed around race, right? So race was a way in which you understood who were the most important people and not. And then you could use people according to how you categorize them. And we know this happens in other kinds of categorizations. I think what we are seeing in the post-colonial world is an evolution of these technologies of disposability. So you may be able to navigate the racial category, you may be able to become a Black billionaire or a woman CEO, but the other forms of disposability that are produced, the gig economy, the destruction of social welfare systems and all of these kinds of things come to take their place. And so I think we need to be alive to the change, the continuities and the changes in that framework.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Meera. Emir, would you like to comment at this stage?
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I've been listening with a lot of interest to all of you. I guess I'll have to disagree with some of you in order to get this conversation a bit more interesting. I do actually fundamentally disagree with some of the issues that have been raised here. So, for example, colonization seems to be seen just as a political movement. And so when you say that colonization ended, you're talking about the political direct intervention and control of a particular land or a piece of land. But that is not just colonization, right? If we want to think of colonization, especially in a historical depth, then we need to redefine colonization as when one group of people take advantage of other groups of people for their own interest. Now, if that's how we see colonization, then colonization has never ended. What we have seen is a sense, are phases of colonization. The traditional colonization, which people consider colonization, I call it colonization 1.0, the traditional model. What people consider the post-colonial world, which is not post in any way when we use the categories and we live in categories that were created and manufactured by the colonials. The very idea of a state did not exist in a world which was pre-colonial. The idea of a nation state that we are talking about, the security of a nation state, did not exist. Standing militaries and armies did not exist. None of this existed. The models of education, literacies, numeracies, the frameworks for education, the very foundations of madrasas, for example, did not exist in a pre-colonial world. So if you want to think about it, think about it as let's say there's a jug of water on a table, and I come over and I grab the jug of water. Now everybody says, oh no, this is not your water, man, you gotta leave, and say, all right, I'm gonna leave. But when I've left, what you find is there is no jug and there is no clear glass of water, a mug of water anymore, jug of water anymore. Yeah. But the glass has been reformed into smaller glasses, and each glass is full of colored water of each different color. So it's sort of, that's the world that we are seeing to be sold as of a post-colonial world. There is nothing similar between the pre to the post to call it post, right? The other thing is, of course, it hasn't ended. And in a recent essay that I wrote, I talk about how we are actually morphing into colonization 3.0, where with essentially COVID has been turned into and weaponized into something that allows a whole different shift in how the relationship between people and communities exists in various ways, in which hierarchies of knowledge are maintained. So, for example, knowledge we know is an infinite concept. Something that is infinite should not have an inherent hierarchy. Yet at the same time, we know that knowledge is created into hierarchies where we see certain knowledge as A+ and others as not A+ and some as bad. How can that be if knowledge in itself is an infinite system? It can only happen when an infinite is turned into a finite, where we think of knowledge as a finite, which we do, which is again a colonial way of thinking, because knowledge is an infinite. It cannot be a goal, because as a goal, it's infinite, it's unachievable. And yet we have turned it into a goal where all of our educational institutions are running after this sort of knowledge. A PhD itself is seen as creation of new knowledge. Everybody's talking about knowledge is power. What is knowledge itself? It's just infinity. It exists everywhere. It exists in every form and shape. To give it a hierarchy is taking an infinite and then turning it into a finite and then controlling who becomes the managers of the finite. You see the same thing as, in a sense, if we look at some of the principles through which colonization was established, those principles haven't changed. So if those principles haven't changed, how has colonization ended? Right. So, for example, if we were to think about one of the principles that the Europeans applied was turned currency, which used to be material in a pre-colonial world. What I mean by that is an ounce of gold and the value of an ounce of gold is the same. So the value of an ounce of gold is the ounce of gold. It's one and the same thing. The material is the value. What happened with the colonial economic systems is the value shifted to a non-material system, a number system. A number system is by definition infinite. It's infinite. So again, it's an infinite. So if money is an infinite concept, then why is money such a finite concept in your and my existence? Why? Because somebody converts that infinite into a finite and then manages the finite, right? So for example, again, in this case, it's the state. The state has the authority to create money. You and I cannot. But if the state is strong enough, they can just create money out of nowhere. Another 1.5 trillion out of nowhere. How? It's just a number coming up in a computer screen. How does it happen? Because there is no materiality to it. So notice that one of the principles through which the colonizations grabbed and controlled and took over power, one of them is a shifting of the infinites to finites and controlling them. And controlling them in ways that we can see that the whole world has the same categories. Amira was also talking about categories. Essentially, those who create categories can create the power and manage it, right? Because those categories are then managed in certain ways. Now, I know that I've said a number of things that people would want to respond to it as well. And I don't want to take too much time, but I want to sort of summarize some of my ideas and talk about these ideas in a poetic form. So I'll share my screen here and I will read it with you. It's a short poem. You will see it's in two sections, 1850s, 1940s. Hossein Nadeem, it's interesting you started off by referring to 1940s. So it's essentially it's a short conversation between a junior officer and a senior officer at across two different times. So the first one is happening in 1850s. The poem is called Splendid, simply splendid. Sir, the danger is increasing. The natives are resisting. How ignorant, how savage. They don't appreciate our attempts to salvage. How can they know what's best for them? Let's save them in our God's name. Burn their books, destroy their past. Let us teach them what we want. Introduce money, buy us friends, give some wealth and lots of lands. Teach people religion to hate each other, break their union into different nations. Create new symbols, build new systems, change the ways they think and function. When this is done, come back to me and I will tell you what next can be. Time moves on to the 1940s. Sir, I am pleased to report our progress. Your directives has brought us success. The natives are divided and broken. They are killing each other in dozens. Splendid, simply splendid. And now for the next bit. Let us retire to our beautiful estate. Let our friends govern their new states. With our stories to guide their future, we can relax and let them suffer. Sell them books and let them know if they want progress, they can come for more. Invite some natives, give them means, turn them into posters for the rest to dream. When this is done, it will be seen. Those who fought us now fight in between. Splendid, simply splendid. I will, I think, just stop there and let the conversation go. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmer. Anyone has a comment on that? I think Homi Bhabha has his pen up. You're mute, sir. Can you unmute yourself, please? Yeah.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you for your comments, and also thank you for the poem. Let me just say this, that there are I don't on the one hand, I don't see why you thought that your comment would be out of step at one level with either Zarar or Mira or myself. I mean, we argued, and I certainly did myself, and I think our other friends have too, that there is no moment that either the colonial mentality stops. That's why I started off by saying that the post-colonial is about forms of transition and transformation, mediated also through our own national governments, our own anti-colonial national governments. So I think this, I at least don't see a paradigm shift in what you are suggesting. I think we were all saying that it's a much more complicated and subtle forms of dependency, independence, exploitation, securitization. So I think that there I don't see any difference. I mean, this is a philosophical difference. I don't think knowledge is infinite. I think knowledge is profoundly material. It happens at certain times. It happens in certain places. The Italian Renaissance had introduced particular knowledges. The Egyptians introduced particular knowledges. Sanskrit and Islam introduced particular knowledges. So I take a much more materialist view about knowledge. And therefore, I believe that knowledge and power, as indeed I think most of your examples showed, irrespective of your saying knowledge was infinite, most of your examples showed that the regulation of knowledge produces knowledge. that knowledge is not something free that floats high and people grab at it and regulate it. Knowledge is produced in the process of regulation. I think it's a much more dynamic and dialectical form. I have to say, my friend, that I am worried about this. Let's go back to the time when a piece of gold was a piece of gold. Yes, you're right. There are moments of equivalence, but even in societies of equivalence, there is always representation. The fact that you can bring a pound of flesh, a pound of gold, and say, can I have the equivalent of that? That's a different system. I think, and here I think you're contesting fundamentally notions of representative government, notions of representation in the cultural domain, and in some ways you are contesting, in my understanding, the notion of modernity. Now, that modernity emerged out of a colonial history is absolutely clear. But if we keep going back and saying, what would have happened if that had not happened? That's an interesting counterfactual, but it doesn't help us to deal with the problems that we're dealing with now. And in fact, I think that mode of thinking, if we had gone back to times when there were no states, if we had seen what was another kind of modality of modernity, we have no way of telling because of the history of the world, which is regrettable. But I think that one of the things we begin to see with that mode of thinking is, in my view, what is most reprehensible, my dear friend, happening in India today. In India today, they want to wipe out the mediations, the representations of Islam, of the huge contributions made by Muslim peoples. They want to keep going back. They say, this is all part. Now, if we only go back to the origins of Hindutva, we will see very clearly how all these material historical modalities are really not essential. There are people who argue, as you know, that the Taj Mahal is a Hindu monument.
Correct.
Not only that, my friend, that might be one crazy guy who I watch on television when I'm in Bombay. But not only that, what has happened now? Outside the Taj Mahal, they built a museum by a British architect, as you know. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I think I should here. A museum for Mughal and Islamic Indian art. These are our citizens. These are people who chose to be and to contribute to our lives in India. And what has happened? They have decided no longer to use it as a museum for the Islamic heritage of India, and they will rename it and they will use it for their own purposes, as indeed is being done in many cultural institutions. So I'm suggesting to you not at all that you're part of this mode of thinking. But if we keep going back, you also have this situation that we have in India today, which is deeply hurtful and regrettable to me. And I'm a Parsi, right? And I just want to say that in response. And I think Mira just very quickly made some very good points. And I want to say that here again, I talk about education for citizenship, not only education for expertise. I think one of the real problems is, as humanists, those of us who are, to us, interpretation is central. You called it reflection, Mira, but the fact that knowledge and facts need to be interpreted in order for values to be ascribed to them. On their own, they may not have a value structure. Interpretation is so important that I think what has happened is algorithms as filters have tried to restrict a plural democratic interpretation. That's just what I wanted to say. And then, of course, the question of expendability. But of course, in India, you have the caste system. So expendability is also a longer problem than what we have now. And it is a problem that, as you know very well, that the caste was also part of the nationalist struggle. Gandhi's idea that without caste, India would have lost its fundamental structures, cultural structures. Of course, he disliked immensely the fact that some people were untouchables. But as Ambedkar said very clearly, just by renaming them as God's children, Harijans, are you really giving them agency? Are you really giving them freedom? So I just want to suggest that we are confronted with Hussein's presence in a much more complex tapestry of problems and histories. And I thank you so much for making me part of this conversation.
Absolute pleasure, sir. Zirar,
Hussein, I'm going to have to take my leave. So thank you very much, and thank all of you. I wish I could stay here for the next 6 hours, but I would get fired, and I do have to eat and pay rent Monday and things like that. So thank you all so very much, and I look forward to watching the recording of this to see what all I've missed. All right, so I'll take.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Bye. Take care, sir.
Okay, Meera, would you want to respond to Dr. Bhaba's comments?
If you want to take the Q&A, I mean, I think that's fine. I'll maybe just say one thing, which was an interesting conversation I was having with my students. I teach a class called Decolonizing World Politics. And one of the questions that came up in the very first week, which continued to animate us during the course, was, what is the difference between nation building and colonialism, really, right? They use a lot of the same techniques. You're trying to erase multilingualism, you're trying to put people into a particular box in terms of their identity, you're trying to incorporate them into a particular economic system. And whilst, we had a number of conversations about what the specificities of colonialism were as a strategy of rule, really the boundaries between nation building and colonialism can be very blurry. And I think in a lot of the spaces, and we see now in China and India, in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Kashmir, that the strategies of empire are being rehabilitated as strategies of nation building, or so-called nation building, in many of these spaces. So all of us who are interested in these kinds of issues should be very alive to the very porous boundary between those two types of things.
And the question of consent, which is such a problematic issue, and how we deal with that. And of course, in Pakistan, you have very many similar issues, and we haven't spoken about that. I hope in the question and answer period, we can explore some of those issues.
Definitely, sir. We'll definitely do that. Now, I have 2 options, because we've already jumped gun on the social media side, and also on one of the interesting questions that I think there was a general consensus within our group on taking on this question. And I think that's one of the questions that keeps coming up in the Muslim world, and generally in the developing world as well, is essentially this idea that why are some human rights struggles more important than the others? This is one of the things. I mean, I remember when there was an attack in Paris, there was a lot of condemnation, and there was world came together. But within some of the peripheries and within some of the countries in the global south, to say, there was also this reaction and question back. But what about us? I mean, we lose lives on the daily basis. So there was this comparison. Is blood cheaper in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other parts of the world? And where is the moral conscience of the global society when it comes to that? So when we look at, for instance, the Kashmir problem, 8 million people living under a sort of lockdown, for that matter, for the last 1 year or more. How is that different from the Black Lives Matter? And the Black Lives Matter, how is that separate from other movements that are there? Dr. Bhaba, I would really want you to help us understand, because I know this is one of the core questions that go around in the developing world, and why the, sorry to say, hypocrisy.
Thank you very much. I think that there is no question in my mind that the general invocation of human rights ignores the fact that some countries, some people are more human, quote unquote, than others, as the convenience of world politics shifts and its own strategies and interests and outcomes require. Of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a document, and like many documents and conventions, it has certain uses, and it also covers up a whole lot of problems. I have been working on this, and I have been looking, as many people do, at the working papers of the committees. And when you read those, you see that what you get in the actual convention is in some ways an anodyne, not always, but in some ways an anodyne distillation of controversies which are deeply historically rooted. One group of people saying, if any mention is made of untouchability, or if any mention is made of the second tier citizenship of women, we will not sign. So let us not be naive about these documents. These documents serve a certain purpose. They are a framework, but internally to them also, there are exactly the kinds of questions of equity and inequity that you are now projecting on a wider north-south divide. So I think that the document itself has a history, it's very useful, but it is also problematic. And it is partly problematic because the notion of human dignity in the document, and this is part of the work I'm doing, is inherentist. The idea is that dignity is within you as you are born, and therefore universally, every person has that dignity. It's just one aspect of it, and it's a philosophical aspect. Now, that's not a bad concept of that notion of dignity. But because it is inherentist, on the one hand, people are very comforted. Everybody has that right. In fact, the question you pose is based on that. If everybody is human, if everybody is that inherentist value of rights, why do some people's struggles, why are some people's struggles seen to be violent demands for rights, and other people are seen to be insurrectionists, and so on and so forth? So I think that, again, to go back, the document is only as good as its interpretational lives. These may be legal, these may be ethical, these may be in public discourse. So I think, however, this is a document that we have, just as we have the Refugee Convention, which is a convention that is deeply problematic in certain ways, but it has some protection, it gives some protection to the least protected, and we cannot simply tear it up. So I do believe that it exists, and it exists for a purpose, and in certain respects, it has had a positive move. We are not helped in the Global South when people reject it. When they say this document does not actually speak to our culture. What about the Asian tiger, that these are, Asian human rights are very different. Asian human rights are very different. Therefore, at one stage in Singapore, there were all kinds of restrictions on the freedoms of people. And they said, well, these are not restrictions for us. This is our way of life. Or in the Middle East, or in China. This idea that, human rights, there is a fundamental truth that human rights have to be translated. They are not there. I do not believe simply in their universalism as being applicable across the world. Of course not. But if you are committed to equity, freedom of speech, then you have a seat at the table in recasting those rights. But if you reject them and say, this is all a Western document that came out of the Holocaust and is of no relevance to us, then either show us another set of principles which are not only for you, but for all humanity. So I completely agree with you that there is a hypocrisy, but that hypocrisy has to be judged on all sides. There is a hypocrisy in saying we don't believe in these values, they're not our values. Women don't need to have the same freedoms. Dalits don't need to have the same power, and yet we believe in our human rights. Well, let us see what they look like. If you own human rights, if your idea of the rejection of the universalist human rights, which is fine, does not allow you to liberate your own people, to give them a sense of freedom and autonomy, then let us see what your human rights look like. So I think before we have the charge of hypocrisy, I would like to learn. Is there a Eurocentric bias? Of course, there is a Eurocentric bias, although the document was not only written by European people from Latin America, participated hugely. There were representatives from India. In fact, the right of movement, which was very much inspired by the Indian delegate, the woman, Mrs. Mehta, an Indian delegate. She really formulated the right to movement, saying that it was going to be particularly important for minorities. So it seems to me that the fact that the world is Eurocentric, the fact that people don't want to understand the conditions under which other countries suffer their own inequalities, suffer their own sense of being marginalized, is profoundly important and goes back to my question. That knowledge through its institutions, educational, museums, journalists, through its institutions, knowledge is never free of power, and facts always need to be carefully interpreted, and it is only then that we will be able to have equitable notions of agency. I'm not simply interested in the representation of identities of people who are minorities or otherwise. I'm interested in what can that person do in the world to improve their lives and transform the societies in which they live. My argument is for agency, to have people's agency and their interests represented, not only their identities acknowledged. I love my Muslim brother, I love my Christian brother and my sister. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in how much my Indian Muslim sister can actually change the public discourse, can participate in the public sphere, can represent her interests and her agency. I have a very much an agency-oriented view of ethics and politics.
How much do you think is the way human rights language is done on ground plays this part in its rejection? Because I do know that, for instance, in many underdeveloping countries, it's not as such the rights agenda. It's who's leading it. Is it the US Embassy? Is it some foreign donor? Is it the language that they're using? Is that the critical problem? Because all of a sudden in recent times, we've seen that the Uyghur genocide is in public discourse. It was not there for the last 20 years. But as soon as there is some shift in the global political dynamics, there is an interest change that's there. So many of the people ask this question globally, that how is Kashmir not talked about, but US is talking about the Uyghur genocide? So that parallel is there. And then that one level. And on the second level, the question is who's doing it? So when, for instance, in a country like Pakistan, or for instance, I know India has banned a lot of NGOs as well, when they see the US Embassy or the DFID or the World Banks running, for instance, capacity building programs for young children and this and that, that is what creates a sort of problem. So how do you think, I mean, my question essentially would be, should it be organic? Because from what I see, the problem that anything that is from the above or is in an English language doesn't have the same level of traction. So how do you come about changing that equation in a world which is globalized?
Hussein, this is what I just said, that I don't think I don't think that these ideas or these ideals or these documents should have a status which is not translated. Didn't I say that? I said, I want to be able to see how these concepts get translated. And by that, I don't mean only at the level of language or philosophy. I also mean at the level of the institutional infrastructures that you have, the capacity building that you have, the educational system that you have. After all, creating a notion of human rights, even popularly understood, is merely to suggest that we have to be neighbors. We have to be able to extend our sense of visual and ethical inclusion to things that we might find different, things that we might find difficult. So it is a way of dealing with that which is not inherently organic. And that's why I will take up that word. When you have Kashmir, for instance, if you took an organic view emerging out of the current Indian disposition to think about the rights of Kashmiris, as indeed they have been waved aside almost since independence, you would get nothing. You have to have the notion of alterity. You have to have the notion of being able not to look to the West, but to be able to look outside of your own context in order to put yourself under judgment. You see what I'm saying? That is alterity. Alterity is not to run after European model or to run after Brazilian model. Alterity is, how do I as a community set values that I know I have to aspire to and live up to, even though I know that it will be difficult. Alterity is self-examination at that point, setting up a horizon of values. That is what we don't have in the kind of in the kind of political warfare, or in your country, in the cycles of militarization that you have. We don't have that. And I'm sorry, this may be very idealistic, this may be very aspirational, but I genuinely believe it's becoming a real issue now. Kashmir, if you got people to develop an organic Indian human rights document now, I mean, they would find exactly a way of completely bypassing the Kashmir situation. And indeed, if you got that in the Middle East, if you have it, we would know that Palestine would not even feature. So my question, so I'm suggesting to you, that's why I suggested these ideas are translational. And of course, we talk about NGOs. Now, of course, in India, that's making it very, very difficult. Even the Ford Foundation, Mira would know better than me. I think the Ford Foundation is also being considered to be a suspect NGO. And in India, it's a real problem now. I'm sure Oxfam, I'm sure Amnesty will all be seen as these tendentious NGOs. But why do NGOs have such a large space to play? And this is what my colleague Partha Chatterjee once argued. He says NGOs, if I'm interpreting him correctly, he says very often NGOs come in where the state has retreated. The state has decided for various reasons they are not going to invest in creches for children, or they can't, or it's inadequate. That's why these philanthropic NGOs come in. And of course, when the philanthropic NGOs come in, there are problems, just as there are problems with humanitarian intervention. You make the mess and then you bring the humanitarian intervention. So I'm completely in agreement with you that we need to see who are the instruments of these humanitarian initiatives, although they may sound on paper remarkably progressive. We know, for instance, that large amounts of money return to the donor countries, who also then en route develop a kind of prestige, a symbolic soft power prestige amongst people who are being helped. So there are many problems, and I think this is one of the most important aspects of our conversation, is that we have not tried to cover up complex issues. And we have ranged from everything from philosophy and ethics to the nitty-gritty of politics. And I think you have achieved this, and my colleagues have too. So I'm very grateful to you.
Just to give a little bit data on the last point that you made, for the US aid that I studied US aid to Pakistan, per dollar value that actually was put on ground was 8 cents per dollar.
Correct.
Rest, everything was essentially routed back through costs, through maintenance and everything. But this is where I want to take the conversation forward to Meera as well, because I know she's worked on the intervention part and all. There is so much talk about aid, specifically in the underdeveloped world, but there is actually very little impact. How do you see the politicization of this aid? Because it ties back to a very strong colonial tendencies, specifically when we looked at how the winning hearts and minds programs were run. For instance, in Pakistan, I think Hillary Clinton was on record saying that the money was invested to essentially enhance the soft image and the soft voices within Islam. And the funding was routed to a lot of madrasas. And those madrasas were then radicalized in a particular way, which then became a political mess. And we're still facing that. It's a radicalization of the Barelvis that happened in this part of the world. And we've seen a lot of other instances where the State Department was handing over cash under the Kerry-Luke-Berman Act, which becomes problematic because then you have a state in a society which is essentially in contradiction to each other, the national narratives, the discourses. I think one of the projects under the US Freedom of Information, the US spent $60 million on buying airtime in media in Pakistan. So essentially that was for the propagation. And while at one point they were doing the drone strikes, the other time there was also making sure that the narrative is not in a particular way. So in terms of the intervention, because you worked on Mozambique and other countries, the local voices are essentially absent. And when it comes to Pakistan, there is this notion that we have carried of do more. For a very little aid that you've received, it's constantly do more and do more. Where for the last 20 years, I think our generation, I'm 33 right now, we've gone through that phase. I was born in 87 when the Afghan war was ending, the first war. And I'm 33 right now when again the Afghan war, we're hoping that it did end. And I'll come back on the same question is, how do you see this? For instance, in the war conflict zones and the conflict zones, to look at the problem from a very post-colonial lens as such, that the foreign aid and the intervention is not benign. It's not there for development. It's for all the other reasons that are there. So what would you comment on that?
Okay, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I would say a few things. The first thing is that one of the biggest problems with aid, one of its most pernicious effects, is the way it breaks the relationship between the state and society. So this is the dimension that you talked about. It introduces mistrust and suspicion about where the funding is coming from and where it is going. It introduces priorities which may or may not reflect priorities on the ground. It introduces all kinds of bureaucratic inefficiencies, like you said, the amount of money that actually stays in the country, and it wastes everybody's time apart from anything else. So there's a lot of layers of problems with aid and how it affects recipient societies. From the point of view of the donor, I suppose I would say there are actually two different logics that govern, let's say, British aid. One of them is certainly, if you like, the counterinsurgency logic. So we are going to do this in Afghanistan. We are going to win hearts and minds. We are going to embed our provincial reconstruction teams with some charity workers and some military people. And clearly their aid is being used as a stabilization or pacification measure. There is the other kind of aid, which I think is more about, if you like, the narcissistic tendency. This is about, we are doing this because we are philanthropic, we want to help. There is a third kind of aid which is possible, but which is much rarer and more difficult to achieve, which is aid, which is really about solidarity. Like, we are really giving you something which you have said that you need and that you want, and on terms which you are defining and controlling, and we are not trying to control how you spend that money or how you do that. Now, that's not very popular because people talk about corruption, and of course this is an issue. It's also not popular because you then ultimately lose control of the thing. But there's three different things, I would say, at least, going on the donor side. And in Britain, at least, weirdly, the second type is receding. The third type almost never existed, but the second type is certainly receding, and now foreign aid is being more explicitly repurposed for geopolitical purposes and for British national interests. On the recipient side, I mean, just to flag, and this speaks to the discussion about human rights as well. Human rights are a terrain of struggle. They're a weapon that people can use against more powerful institutions, and they can try to make claims on their basis. I don't think anybody defends human rights just because they're interested in human rights in an abstract sense. They're interested in their right to protest something, or their right to some land or something else, you know, in specific contexts. And I think one of the most perniciously damaging myths has been the thing that was already alluded to by Professor Baba, which is the idea that human rights were only a Western invention for the West. Actually, the historical evidence is that lots of the elements were lobbied for in spite of the West, right? And in spite of what they wanted to do in terms of maintaining control of areas, ditto rights of self-determination and so on. So I hope that one thing that we can do as people, as citizens of the world in whatever spaces we happen to be in, is to stop attacking each other on the basis of claims to some authenticity, which is always a receding horizon. It's always a kind of a false claim, and it's a way of shutting down certain kinds of debate, but really to engage with each other on the basis of the content of what we are saying and how this does or doesn't relate to the spaces in which we are and the values that we hold. And those values are going to be different in different spaces. So this is not an argument against having your own thing. It's an argument against shutting people down based on the supposed provenance of their ideas, which might in any respect be messy.
Bravo again. That was so articulate and so much in keeping, I think, with what I was trying to say. And I thank you so much for putting it so much better than me. It's wonderful. Thank you. Really heartening to hear that.
Emma, would you like to chip in on specifically the aid question?
On the aid question, I will probably take a different dimension to this. Let's say, for example, in terms of the aid, one of the main forms of aids is educational support. And again, I would like to come back to the point of knowledge. And I know Professor Baba said, for him, knowledge is finite. For me, knowledge is infinite, because knowledge has no bounds. There is no limit to it. There is never a definitive knowledge. And in relation to that, and especially in terms of aid, in terms of education, one of the things, there are multiple things that happens. One, there is this general sense of when we go to a university in the West, when we come here, when I went to the US, or when we create our own institutions, we borrow the disciplinary areas that were created in the West, right? So we borrow disciplines like, say, sociology and psychology and anthropology and cultural studies and religious studies and literature and linguistics and all these things going on, maths, physics, chemistry, all of these disciplines. Now, where are these disciplines coming from? What are their histories? Where were they set up? So when were they established? What are the foundational theories in these disciplines? And if you go into and look at and trace the roots of any of these modern disciplines, they go down to areas of colonization. And what you also realize is that most of the frameworks and set of assumptions that were established at that time in defining and setting up these disciplines have never been questioned. They continue to perform and act in the same way that they were 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when they were developed as tools and instruments for the process of colonization, right? So for example, my own discipline, linguistics, the roots of linguistics, where does it lie in? It lies in the fact that language was used to divide communities and divide people, giving them labels. Hindi and Urdu, when it's Hindustani, is mutually intelligible, right? So something that is mutually intelligible, you give it two names. You use two different writing systems. Now notice again, writing system and literacy, which is pushed through United Nations and UNESCO, right? Literacy is seen as a goal of education. Now, literacy in no way is a universal human feature. Oral language is, right? Written language is not. And when written language does exist, it comes in so many different forms and formats, not just the way it's done through English. So when we look at how, for example, aid in the sense of getting people educated in certain ways of thinking and certain ways of dividing the world and carving up the world comes up, we see again this constant push of the categories built in European context and then pushed upon us. Nowhere do we actually stop and say, hey, is there any legitimacy to even the very fact that they're creating here as a discipline, right? So for example, the discipline of biology, if a biologist cannot define life, what are they studying? And go into it and check it out. Biologists do not have a definition of life. Instead of being able to define life, they talk about characteristics of life. They talk about some things that are breathing, or people things that are reproducing, and they have a diet and things like these. These are features and characteristics of things that are living. But this is not a definition of life. Yet biology is a study of life. And you see this again and again. It's the same thing in linguistics. Traditional linguists have no definition of what language is, and yet they name languages and parse them out, right? You find this again and again, that these fields and these disciplines are based in very colonial interests, very colonial ways of thinking, and their own goals. Even Darwin, I mean, for example, Darwin is very clear in his own writing that evolution does not happen by itself, that evolution is something that co-occurs in relation to and responds to other environmental and geographical conditions and factors. And yet when we see the popularization of evolutionary theory, we see it as an evolution of a species, not co-species, not co-evolution of multiple species. It's not happening together. And again, if we take a time to break away from this literacy-based knowledge that is given to us as legitimized knowledge, and just take a step away from it and do some observational and geographical thinking, we will actually perhaps reject a lot of this stuff as being, recognizing it as just bullshit. Because as soon as you start moving away from basing all your thinking on references and citations, and moving away from the citations and references into the observational geographic world where the people actually live, then you start realizing that a lot of this philosophical stuff in academia, all these terms, all these concepts, they're nice things to talk about. Academics can make a living out of it, but it has no relationship with the lives of the people. So I think the first thing we really need to do is decolonize academia itself. And again, I understand that colonization, even for post-colonial theories, isn't something that has ended. But the term itself, post-colonial, now, we can argue about how post is not really post in a very intellectual way. But for a common person, when they see the word post-colonial, the name, the concept is post-colonial. It's post-colonial, after colonial. They don't have the time or the interest to think about all the, sort of dainty at different dimensions of what post might be or post might not be, and how it can be post in different ways. For them, it's a very concrete term. It's post-colonial. For them, they see it, oh yes, we are no longer living in a colonial world. So the term, the title post-colonial is misleading. Even though as an academic, as intellectuals, we question this, but again, we have to think about what language does. Language creates impressions, language creates realities, language creates the world that we live in. The world we live in does not exist without it. And to say that aid comes with education and it comes with language, English being the language. Now, just let's, for example, again, looking at South Asian context, go back 150 years ago. 150 years ago, South Asia had 3 recognized genders, right? Males, females, and neuters, 3 genders. So there were 3 categories for gender in South Asia. Now today, it's 2. Where did it get reduced? How did 3 gender categories get reduced to 2 sexes, males and females, which leads to the various kind of conflicts we see in the region? Now, imagine we had 3 genders. What was the socialization of a community based on 3 genders? We can't even imagine it. It doesn't exist because all of our reality today is based on this colonial idea of 2 sexes. Where does it come from? 2 sexes are based on a biological distinction, not a sociological distinction. And again, you will see, it's whenever it's convenient for European sciences and things, they will take biological constructs and shape sociology out of it. You see that happening with males and females. You don't see gender distributions. Now, those go into forms that get into forms, right? We start writing who we are. On a passport from India or Pakistan, there are only two options, right? So you get into these options, when you get into these selections, you get into these categories. Where are these categories based? In English, in Western languages. You talk about human rights, the very concept of rights and human rights don't exist in other languages. The notion of a human doesn't necessarily exist throughout the world. Literacy is not universal. Numeracy is not universal. The idea of numbers being 0, 1 to 10 is not universal. None of it is. And yet we keep thinking around these big terms because they come to us in English. You know, and they're promoted to us in English. They're conceptualized in English. There is no translation of these things in other languages. It just doesn't exist. And then we force translations into these languages. When we force translations, we actually say things that are untrue because we are forcing translations into things that don't exist. And we do it again and again and again. And by creating these fake news, fake academia that, you know, is built on citations rather than observations, we create these illusions and then we perpetuate these illusions, and we want people to create this new knowledge in these little disciplines without even taking a second and pausing. Where does this discipline come from? What are the origins of it? Is it actually designed? It is actually designed to do something that's good for us, or are we actually perpetuating the colonial interests by further dividing groups based on language, based on caste, based on religion, based on any of these terms? All of these categories, all of them are categories. The word religion itself doesn't have an equivalent translation in South Asian languages. You know, sometimes people say mazhab. Mazhab is not religion. Sometimes people say deen. Deen is not religion. These terms are not equivalent. Then there is no translation for religion in South Asian languages, and yet we create one. Religion itself is a category. It doesn't even exist as a concept other than a category. Again, these categories, where do they come from? They come from the 19th and 18th century European thinking. All the European frameworks of thinking are based in 18th, 19th century, right? We think about our great leaders, Gandhi and Jinnah and Nehru. Where were they educated? In the UK, right? What were they educated in? In legal terms, their discourses were embedded within European thought. These people then became the leaders. Guess what they perpetuate? They perpetuate the ways of thinking of the Europeans, based in and trained in European thought and philosophy, right? So we have this continuous trade of thoughts through which we divide and people based on academic disciplines, based on ways in which academic disciplines operate. And yet we don't question them, but rather we actually participate and further extend the hegemonic discourses of how these disciplines are and how we are all these disciplines work. Where's the reality to it, right? Coming back to these things, I just find that it's very easy often for us to sort of, you know, get lost in this world of academia where so much is based on citations and references and referencing and citations and getting published based on citation and references. But that's just the way that academia operates. And if you really want to look at it, who does academia serve? The only real industry that academia serves is the publication industry. It's the publishers who get rich and rich and rich from all the work we do. We don't. So we also have to think about what academia itself is. What is the role of academia within the colonial state? And what purposes does it serve? Do we not need to decolonize the very way that we create knowledge and knowledge structures and the very ideas of what university is and knowledge is? Or should we just adopt these ideas from the West because that's what they've been doing and just perpetuate them and extend them by basing it further and creating new other niches and sub-niches and sub-disciplines and sub-specializations, which yes, they keep parting, but they keep parting to a point where it makes no sense any longer. And yet we call this specialization something that's extremely valuable. We give people these degrees and titles based on this without questioning what does it actually do for us? What do all these PhDs, Hussein Nadeem, like yourself and others? I mean, I know you're different, but so many of these PhD students that I see come through Australian universities and other, what do they actually gain out of a PhD? What do they actually learn? To carry out a survey? To write a literature review? What is that? What is the change? If we want education to empower people, then education needs to empower the very people we are training in the first place. There is no such empowerment. What we see is that graduates from modern education are dependent on corporations. Indigenous education made people independent. Modern education makes people dependent on somebody else to give you a job. You have no means to live by yourself. So you see, education makes people dependent, not independent. If something is not making you independent, how can it be decolonizing force or a post-colonial force of any kind? Essentially, mass education, public education, academia reinforces these hierarchies. And in many ways, we as academics reinforce it unless, of course, we question them and challenge them and change the very shape in which they operate. And I think we should, because unless and until we shape the very ways in which knowledge is created, what knowledge is created, for what purposes it's created, by who it's created, who are the legitimate owners of it, people like us will always be second-hand citizens, following somebody else's guides and somebody else's categories and trying to fulfill their goals. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mehboob. Because of the shortage of time, I'm going to let Dr. Bhabha respond to a few of the priority points that are raised in this. You're mute, sir. Can you unmute yourself, please? Dr. Bhabha, you're still mute. You're on mute, sir. Yeah, you're good now.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you very much for your observations. I'm going to actually be very brief here because there are you raised many important issues. I think that just a few points which in counterpoint to what you said. I think in a way, everything you said, Amar, actually made me think that knowledge, I never said knowledge was finite. What I said is knowledge is material. It comes out of material, it's not finite. So I think everything you've said, whether I agree or not, about knowledge formation and the power of knowledge and the bodies of knowledge, all the examples you gave, pre-colonial, post-colonial, etc., are absolutely, or current indigenous versus academic, I think gives some credence to the view that knowledge is part of a materiality. It's part of a historical materiality. It's part of a conceptual materiality, that it is not infinite. And I think you are the best spokesman for the point I was trying to make about the materiality and historicity of knowledge. And your critique is in a way based on that. Who gave us these disciplines? How do we rethink these disciplines? I also think that a lot has happened, that's another conversation, in rethinking disciplines, amongst them, and disciplinary boundaries. And I think the work, from what I know of Mira, and I'm sure your own work, is part of this. And I think there are many others who are trying to question the genealogies of knowledge and their politics. So I don't think this is a job that has not begun. I think it's a job that needs to be done. And I quite agree with you. So I really think that this notion of knowledge as being finite or infinite is finite was not my idea. It was material, it was complex, it was constructed in various places, in the street, in the village, in the academy, in the bureaucracy. All these are the material prompts. And so I would suggest that that is, I think, the way in which one gets a political and ethical hold on knowledge, and one can transform it. The other point I just wanted to make was that yes, of course, if we think only about translation as English being the horizon of translation, and you're right to say English is a hegemonic language, but English is also a very global language now. You know, maybe Mandarin will take its place, maybe Spanish will take its place, maybe Hindi will take its place in time. I'm not sure. Maybe Urdu will take its place. All these are possibilities. But it does seem to me that translation is really not simply about finding the equivalence of one word or concept in another. I've written a bit about translation, and I've read and thought about it, translation is always about creating something else, something which is communicable, something which clearly alludes to what you're translating. But the success of a translation is to open up what I've called a third space. And this is not an academic issue. This is an issue of communication. In a way, all translation is hybrid. One of the great German linguists in the 19th century, as you well know, said the issue is not to turn Hindi into German, but to turn German into Hindi. And what is being said there is not simply the inversion of one language in terms of another to install a new hegemony. It is to create new languages. And I think that I would absolutely here go with Mira, as I was saying before she made her important intervention, that we need to in that sense, need to translate notions of the human. And to do that, in my view at least, I'm skeptical about claims of universality, just as I've been skeptical about other ahistorical and unmaterial claims. So I feel that, in fact, the differences on this panel are much less so. And that's why I suggested, and I agree with you, that academia or academics is not about citationality. None of us in this conversation have resorted to citationality. But it is about education for certain forms of citizenship. And I say that because then there is an autonomy, a regional autonomy. What is citizenship? What is citizenship where you are? And not only what is citizenship, but increasingly we have to think about it in terms of cultural and historical displacement. The migrant, in my view, and I've said this before, the notion of the refugee or the migrant is at the heart of the citizenship. It's not what is not the citizen. To me, the moral center of what the citizen is based on who the refugee is. Because everything we try to do with citizenship is to avoid the fate of the refugee, the displaced person, the stateless person, the person who has no rights. And I'm not talking about rights only in terms of natural rights or human rights. I'm talking about rights, as I said earlier, as the capacity for agency and self-representation. So it seems to me that we are in a very difficult situation. And one of the great, Hussein, one of the great advantages of your moderating this is that you have not allowed us to lapse into some kind of archaic academicism, nor have you allowed us to sit in some comfortable place of presentism. You have made us think about concepts in action, in agency. And I think that this conversation, as it is, as I heard it, and I could not hear myself, but as I heard my colleagues and yourself, is an example of this bridging that we need. The world is too complex for us to polarize it, to binarize it, or to isolate it into islands. I really think that the bridging moments, and that's only a metaphor, but once you have a bridge, you know what's on the other side of the banks and the traffic that moves from one to the other. So I just want to thank you for that, as I know that our time is coming to an end here.
Yes, we are on the very last few 10, 15 minutes of our conversation. And on that point of action, I'm just going to ask one more question from our the panels, and then I'll move on to one or two questions from the audience, which are going to be very brief. A lot of them have already been covered, but there's just one question that was really important. I think that when you mentioned about the action part, I think that's also very important. Is there's a general sense in Pakistan and perhaps the Muslim world as well, I'm not sure about India, that President Trump, for all his follies, was an anti-war and anti-status quo president when it comes to foreign policy, under whose presidency deeply colonial tendencies of the US foreign policy were very much restrained. Now, this is not my opinion. This is generally the perception that I'm talking about. The the real question over here is that I think the conversations we have over here are about the left, center, right politics, and how is that shaped over the past few decades, where you have right-wing presidents and right-wing groups that are wanting to end wars, and you have the left-leaning, the liberal, the neoliberal brigades, pro drone strikes for that matter, pro wars in the Middle East, pro interventions. It may not be, I mean, I know for a fact that this has been discussed thoroughly in the academia, but I think for the audience in the larger populace where we talk about and the students that I engage with, one of the things I really want you to answer is help them understand how is this system working, where you have a right-wing president. For instance, there is one big criticism on President Obama that he is the only president who has dropped more bombs and devastated more countries, while his entire campaign, which I was also a part of, was all about anti-war. So how does that actually shift and happen, and is left anymore and is right anymore? So if you could shed some light on that.
Well, that needs much wiser people than me, but I'll take a quick crack at it. You're absolutely right. I myself have felt in a very similar way. Is right and left? I don't think it is, and I tell you why. I just did a lecture at Oxford last week about what I call the fragility of democracy, using the January 6th moment to say, yes, people said that this is against freedom of voting. American democracy was absolutely at the center of it. The Capitol was invaded. But don't forget that the white supremacist Make America Great Again mob, what they set up in front of the Capitol was a gallows with a hanging noose. And that gallows with a hanging noose, the most immediate reference there is about the hanging of slaves and post-slaves and Black populations. And what it is a reminder of is American genocide of Native Americans. So what I'm trying to say is democracy is a very fragile thing. You can use the vote and everything leading up to the vote to vote in somebody who is quasi-fascist. But you can also vote in somebody who sits on the presidential bench and is unable, because they cannot maneuver in a bipartisan way, doing things that they should not be doing. So I think that with Theodore Adorno, I always feel, he said one time, I am more worried about the fascistic tendencies within democracy than I am by fascists who come out and say we're fascists. And I think there are deeply problematic histories, empire being one of them. And by the way, I've never stuck to the post-colonial, and I don't like it stuck around my neck either. Nowadays, people talk about decolonization. I was in South Africa just before the lockdown. Decolonization is the big thing there. In England, in many ways, there are also issues with decolonization. How do you decolonize when you have your own democratic nation that you voted in and your parties? What are you decolonizing from? But I don't think any of these terms matter. What matters really is the discussion we have been having. So here I want to say, first of all, I agree with you. I'm deeply troubled by the use of democratic procedures and practices to actually do things which are against the spirit of any global democratic aspiration. Let me also say to you that I think that Trump has a way of making you as an individual, not only as a citizen, also as a citizen, but it making you feel creepy as an individual. I don't know, there is something about that affective thing. There is something about the arrogance. There is something about the language. There's something about the rhetoric, the presence, the shamelessness. But that should not hide the fact that what happened under George W. Bush, under the weapons of mass destruction, which we could say is a conspiracy theory. I've even gone so far, it's obviously not in the same ways in which QAnon is conspiracy, but we could actually say at the end of the day the huge destruction, destabilization, displacement of peoples. So I'm completely aware of that. I think, and of course, that was a Republican government, but it was one that stood against the Trumpian issue. I think that in terms of Trump, I mean, I think you've got to see this in two ways. One, you've got to think whether nations as powerful and wealthy as the United States should, in the best circumstances, play an international role or not. If you say they should play an international role, my dear friends, forget enlightened self-interest. Many powerful countries, the only thing they know is seduce and abandon, to use a term from the 19th century novel. Seduce and abandon. And if it doesn't help that most of these people are men, are male leaders. So I don't want to make too strong a point, but I think it's not a certain masculinism of power, a certain shamelessness that goes with it is important. But let me just say, if Trump, for I think economic reasons largely, and because he wanted the local military to sort of support him, didn't want to lose Americans in foreign countries, and I understand nobody should be losing their lives to defend unless you absolutely have to. Don't forget that he started a war in the country itself. He started a civil war against Muslims. He started a civil war against Mexican migrants. He ended up by starting a kind of war internally against women and women's rights. He started a war against journalists and free speech. So the alternatives are problematic. But I want to say both things, that he started wars internally, which have left this country so riled that 147 Republicans refused to endorse an election which every court and every official of every political hue, every officer, could not be brought to say was illegitimate in any way. So I'm saying to you, yes, he did want to reduce the footprint for various reasons, not all of them noble reasons. That doesn't matter. If the soldier's footprint is in your country, it doesn't matter why it's being withdrawn. And I'm completely sympathetic with that. And I say in that context that the Bush, Cheney White House did hugely lasting global destruction around what may have been a conspiracy. I don't know, but there were no weapons of mass destruction. Come on, wag the tail, wag the dog, as they say. But Trump turned that into a virulent war in the country itself. And we have to put that in the balance too.
Thank you so much for that. So a lot of questions from the audience are already been answered. So I was just looking at the questions and I think they've been answered throughout our discussion as well. But there's one question I think for a conclusory question and answer sessions is good. Amal Malik has asked this question to both Dr. Bhabha and Dr. Meera, is how can we build greater reverence for the South Asian canon as a means of eroding Eurocentrism? Can the empowerment of the subaltern work on a micro level, or do we need great structural impetuses?
Meera, it's yours first.
I would always caution against building reverence for canons. I think they are there to be learned from and critiqued and put into dialogue with other things. In the work that I've been doing on decolonizing education, we distinguish between the performative and the informative content of curriculum. Now, what I mean by that is that there is a role modeling effect. So when you put different authors on a canon, one of the things you are saying is that, look, you and people like you or people who are from where you're from can think. They have things which are valuable to say and it is worth engaging with them. And we already know from the work that is done in education that when these thinkers appear, then students from those backgrounds will engage with them more. Women will engage with them more. when the first question in a Q&A is asked by a woman, the number of women who participate subsequently in the Q&A is much higher, and we know all this kind of data. So the empowerment of the subaltern, I mean, we should be careful about the term subaltern. Yeah. Subaltern literally means those who are not speaking, not middle-class women like me who have plenty of platforms on which to engage. That works, but we also just need to be, need not to suspend our criticality for this work, because then we really do get into a dead end and we are unable to think. And there is a lot of this atmosphere in a way going on at the moment that because we are trying to include more people, we are trying to do it in terms which do not subject them to criticality, or if we do subject them to criticality, then it's in a very kind of cautious way. And I think we need to build an environment in which we can take people and their different knowledges and their different perspectives seriously, but taking them seriously also means being critical towards them and putting them into dialogue with others.
Mira, you've spoken so eloquently and comprehensively that I have very little to add. I think this sense of criticality is important because any form of democratic learning, teaching is always a dialogue. There has to be, this is my earlier point about alterity. Alterity is not only bringing to bear on French literature simply the lessons of English literature. It is about how you look at another cultural tradition, locate yourself there, and look back on yourself. So it's about alterity. It's about as much of the difference within and encountering that problem, the things we don't want to acknowledge about ourselves, the people who have not participated in the freedom that we want to do, the texts or the perspectives that we have not integrated, but not only integrating them in a kind of benevolent generosity, which I think, or a philanthropy, which is not the point. The point is then you take that position and look back upon yourself. You displace yourself in the learning process in order to take the next step and create a solidarity. That's how I see this problem. Now, I just want to add here a couple of things. There are some large format issues that we have to look at. For instance, the fact that the knowledge is produced in the global South do not have, for reasons of their own material basis, do not have access to the same kind of public platforms as knowledge is produced in the global North, generally. I used to have the statistics on my mind that there were more, I forget what, there were more articles in Wikipedia about Greenland than there was about the whole of Latin America. And these are not even authorized journals. So I think we need to open up the dialogue by saying there are different standards, different problems in the educational world, in the cultural world. And I think we must rethink the institutions that communicate that knowledge. I think publishing, I know that my friend Amar thinks that we are on the losing end of it, but I do think that media should be opening out to positions, and not simply opening out to them in an act of generosity, but giving them the agency and authority that they need to put their views in a strong way. And I think that that's very important. I think translation is very important across languages, South to South translation, interregional translations. People need to be able to dialogue and to talk in that way in order to develop the criticality in relation to a canon. But I completely agree with Mira that if you actually only make a new canon, canonize something new instead of what you canonized before, you will have all the same problems again. The problems of hegemony, the problems of hierarchy.
Thank you, Dr. Bhabha, for that. And we're just going to move on to our last round, which I'm calling it rapid fire round, not very original, but I'll go with the coffee with the current model on this. This is with Dr. Bhabha, just a few questions that my team and we want you to answer. So 3 emerging scholars we should be following in post-colonial studies.
I can't, that I'm not going to answer that. There are too many people who are doing interesting work. No, I'm not going to answer that one, because I honestly think that there are many people who do different things. And if I answer that question, then I will be thinking for the rest of the day, why didn't I mention X or Y or whatever? And I'm not going to, that's something I'm going to disappoint you.
Get it. So the next question is most exciting concept that you're working on at the moment.
Well, I'll tell you exactly what I'm working on at the moment. I'll make it very brief. I'm working on the way in which systemic racism or systemic inequalities generally have a particular role to play in terms of the construction of policy. They have a long history because systemic knowledges tend to be institutional, and they are very valuable in many ways. They're an archive. But I'm also thinking of what I'm calling traumatic racism, which happens on the street in the 8.46 minutes of George Floyd, in the little video that goes around the world and mobilizes people. That notion of the traumatic, which can happen at any time, irrespective of whether you're a citizen or not, because of the color of your skin, the accent in which you speak, the job which you have, that is a kind of existential, phenomenological agony of experience that is different from dealing with systemic inequalities or systemic racism. Traumatic racism, I see as being a very ongoing problem, and particularly with the 80 million refugees and displaced people we have in the world, who, when they mingle in populations, whatever their legal status, they can be subjects of it, just as people in African Americans or Dalits in India or Muslims in India who have lived there for their generations can also become objects of this kind of traumatic racism. And I'm trying to think both formally, politically, ethically, and philosophically about how we now need not always to say, if we get the system right, if we get that causality right, then we will be in a good place. We can get the systemic things right, and yet at the ethical, the level of the traumatic, the level of the encounter, we may not get it right. And we can talk about getting equality or inequality right, but indignity, humiliation, that has to be dealt with on its own in relation to the systemic. But we cannot think that as soon as the systemic issues are done, then our job is done. So I'm interested in this tension between the systemic and what I'm calling the traumatic. One has a long history, the other is everyday. In fact, the great African-American thinker, politician, poet, W.E.B. Du Bois put it very well for me. And the same sentiment is echoed in Fanon, in Gramsci, and a number of people. Du Bois said, "My pale friend asks me, are you trying to tell me that every day of your life you live under the shadow of discrimination and denigration? You were at Harvard. You then studied in Berlin at the Humboldt. Are you really telling me that every day of your life you have this fear?" And Du Bois said, "No, of course, not every day. But any day, not today, perhaps tomorrow, not in Boston, perhaps in Atlanta, not everywhere, but anywhere." It's this sense of anxiety and uncertainty which I think has come to the fore, both in the global South amongst minorities and others, but also in the West. That's what I'm trying to work on at the moment, the systemic in relation to what I'm calling the traumatic, which then talks also about video and the new technologies, which make a thing happen again and again. It's very different from reading it. You watch George Floyd, you can see it from the middle to the end, you can see it from minute 1 to minute 8:46, and you go on and on. This is what I'm interested in, the iterative, the insulting, the indignity. And I'm trying to work on this.
Thank you. Since India and Pakistan peace process is right now a hard debate, I want to ask your opinion on possible scenario you see for peace in South Asia.
More conversations like this. I would say, I mean, I cannot imagine. I cannot imagine that if these sorts of conversations with patients, with different people around the table were translated. Of course, they can't be, I'm not naive, but I do think that the politicians have failed for so long. The politicians have failed in the Middle East. The politicians have failed here. The politicians in India have failed with Kashmir. There is desperation now. I am no leader at all. I'm no politician, but I'm only saying to those who have the power, who have the charisma, which I don't have, who have the institutions, that we need to have these dialogues. We need to have people-to-people, group-to-group dialogues. We need, and whether it's under the term of the Lahore Literary Festival or it's under the aegis of whatever else it is, of your wonderful organization, we need to do this on a regular basis. And we need to listen to the problems that people want us to address, not just those that we want to address. And for that, I'm happy to throw post-colonialism out of one window and decolonization out of another, and deal with whatever problems are on the ground and in our minds.
That's very interesting. All right, 3 tips for students of post-colonial studies. Should they give up studying post-colonialism?
Sorry, what did you say?
3 tips for students of post-colonialism, because that's a budding field in Pakistan right now.
First of all, never let orthodoxy grip you. And here I go back to Mira's point about not canonizing canons. Don't allow any thought that seems to you difficult be an obstacle to your moving forward. My entire life has been spent in dealing with problems I do not even fully understand now, but trying to work with them. And my life has also been spent in talking about things I don't know anything about. So honest to God, I never, if something bugs me, like the work I'm doing just now on the pandemic, on public health and public death in terms of race. I mean, what do I know about epidemiology? And yet somehow I want to work with it. So don't let any disciplinary straitjacket stop you from dealing with the problems you want to deal with. Your theories and your knowledge are only as good as the lock of the door that you can't open. Once you have a problem with the key, you're on the right track. The other thing I would just like to say, and sounds more sort of slightly aspirational, but it's something that has come to mean a lot to me. As I write, as I think, the past never dies, but the future does not wait to be born. You cannot determine the recurrence of the past as history, as memory, as emotion, as affect. And you cannot predict the moment at which you will be confronted with the future. That is the present. The nest in which we're in is between the future that will not wait to be born and the past that will not die. And in the middle of it all, in the middle of this mess, in the middle of this obscurity and difficulty, we have to try and do the right thing as best we can.
Thank you so much. I think this was great. Part of the reason why I asked this question is because I interact with a lot of students in Pakistan, and a lot of students, including myself, we find inspiration in your work and your wisdom as well. So that was specifically for them. Thank you for answering that. I would like to now invite Brigadier Rashid Ali Janjua, who's the Director of Research and Acting President of our organization, Islamabad Policy Research Institute, to give his closing remarks. And thank you from my side.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody. I'm most grateful to you.
Thank you, Nadeem. I want to express my gratitude for a very, very enlightening discourse by Dr. Homi and other panelists. I think we stand educated on an aspect on which there's a great deal of excitement amongst the intellectual circles here. And for the paucity of time, I think we would have loved on this discussion to go on, because I could see so many questions popping up which are still unanswered. And there is some thirst which I'm sure could be slaked in another such session. And we are looking forward to a lot of alacrity to that session. Some very important takeaways from this discourse are, in the words of Dr. Homi Bhabha, that the past doesn't die and the future cannot wait to be born. Indeed, sir, that's a verity we need to internalize. And very important aspect that was highlighted by Dr. Bhabha in his discourse was the need for education for citizenship. Now we keep getting educated and we keep getting skills and PhD degrees for sciences and STEM disciplines, but how to ensure the equitable notions of equity, as you mentioned, and to educate ourselves into citizenship. That is, I think, a universal challenge. And then he spoke about the agency and the equitable notion of agency. I think that's for the whole mankind to look up to. And another very important aspect which I thought we could not discuss for paucity of time was the center-periphery relationship in the context of post-colonialism, because there is a structure of inequity which is imposed upon the colonized societies, and which for the likes of C.L.R. James, Tagore, François Fanon, they have pointed out, and John Ashcroft has written the Empire Writes Back. It's a kind of an epistemic structural violence that is imposed upon the colonial societies. And I'm sure Dr. Bhabha has, in his eminent scholarship, discussed those themes, and we keep getting educated by those. But I think that's an aspect in which to understand that how those structures of inequities and structural violence, which John Galtung also has written a lot about, affects the habits of colonized societies, that they start mimicry, and from there on, the notion of hybridity that Dr. Bhabha has written a lot about. I think those are very, very interesting and seminal concepts that we need all to debate to get a better understanding of where our interests lie anchored in this changing universe in which there are a lot of competing alliances. There's a new polarization going on at the international level. And I think his ideas can act as a great strategic bridge to make this polarization attenuated and lead to a world which is more inclusive and which is more geared towards geoeconomics instead of geopolitics. With these few words, I once again thank Dr. Bhabha and the panelists for a very enlightening discourse, and I congratulate Dr. Hussain for a very good moderating effort. And I'm sure a similar exercise can be done as a sequel in future to slake our thirst on many aspects that I've highlighted, which have been left. So thank you very much.
Thank you, President Sir. Thank you very much, and thank you, Nadeem. And I'm most grateful to you both. Thank you, Amar. Thank you, Mira. I've learned a great deal. I would be delighted to participate if you so choose in another such conversation down the road. But let me tell you how much I have learned and how optimistic I am as a boy from Bombay with relatives in Karachi, now living in the United States between India and the US, that I could be today, this morning for me, this evening for you in Islamabad. That is a very special feeling. And I thank you for making it possible. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Mira, how nice to meet you.